Ahora vamos a continuar con la exposición de Liliana Laranjo, que se titula Pros and Cons of Healthcare Chatbots, Does the Research Show? Welcome, Liliana. I'm going to introduce you first, but first I want to thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation to be here.
Thank you so much. Now I'm going to introduce you to the audience, and then we're going to play the recorded video, okay? And then we have a time for questions.
Sounds good.
Okay, thank you. Bueno, Liliana Laranjo, como les contaba recién, va a presentar Pros and Cons of Healthcare Chatbots. What does the research show? Perdón. Liliana Laranjo es médica con una maestría en salud pública de la Universidad de Harvard y un doctorado en salud digital. Es profesora principal de atención primaria y comunitaria de la salud en la Escuela de Medicina de Sydney. Ocupa un puesto conjunto con la Red de Salud Primaria de Western Sydney y el Centro de Investigación Aplicada de Westmead. También es investigadora honoraria en el Instituto Australiano de Innovación en Salud de la Universidad de Macquarie. Su investigación actual se centra en mejorar la atención primaria y el uso de la salud digital para promover el cambio de comportamiento, la atención centrada en el paciente y la prevención primaria y secundaria de enfermedades crónicas. Bueno, vamos a dar comienzo al video.
Hi, my name is Liliana, and I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of healthcare chatbots, particularly talking about what the research shows about this topic. So chatbots or conversational agents are systems that mimic human conversation using text or spoken language. And a couple of years ago, we were very interested in better understanding how conversational agents were being used in healthcare, if at all. And so we did a systematic review to try and understand how they were being used in healthcare. And we wanted studies that focused either on consumers, patients, caregivers, but also healthcare professionals. The intervention obviously was a conversational agent, particularly one that allowed for natural language input. And we were interested in any studies that tested the system with human users. And in the end, we included 17 studies that evaluated 14 conversational agents. And these were the ones that focused particularly on patients and consumers. So as you can see, most of them focused or supported mental health. And what they did was provide education, but also psychotherapy support. But really, education was the most commonly provided task that these conversational agents supported. In terms of the studies, the quality of the evidence was not super strong. There was one randomized controlled trial, but the rest were quasi-experimental studies, most of them just single group studies. So not the greatest evidence to form any conclusions by. But it was interesting that the randomized controlled trial evaluated an intervention called Wobot. So Wobot is a chatbot that is available via Facebook Messenger. And what it does is it provides cognitive behavioral therapy, which we know that is effective in supporting patients with depression and anxiety. But we didn't know whether it worked if it was delivered by a chatbot. And this study showed that actually, yes, there was a reduction in symptoms of anxiety in this randomized controlled trial. So this was very interesting. And Wobot has attracted lots of funding and has had great success. And it's one of the indicators of the potential of chatbots in supporting patients. And the studies that evaluated conversational agents supporting clinicians were fewer. So there were only 4 studies. most of the studies, so 2 of the studies supported with mental health related tests, and the other with obstructive sleep apnea and breast cancer. And what they mostly did was supporting with the clinical interview. So there's a standardized questionnaire to diagnose, for example, major depressive disorder or PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or excessive daytime sleepiness. And so what the chatbot does is conduct that interview with the patients, therefore saving time from the clinician perspective. But again, these studies, the quality was not very high. Most of them were quasi-experimental. There was one randomized controlled trial. And then there were 3 other conversational agents that were evaluated, supporting patients and clinicians. And those were mostly telemonitoring interventions. So the focus was supporting chronic disease management, and therefore the chatbot would help with collecting data, for example, blood pressure data, and then providing that to the clinician that would then support the patient with management. And again, the quality of the studies was not very high, and all the studies were quasi-experimental. So what we found with this systematic review was that there were few published studies, and most of them were quasi-experimental and not very high quality. And the studies, their reporting of the methods and of the evaluation measures was very inconsistent and didn't adhere to published standards. So that doesn't help either with forming conclusions in this area. Another thing that was interesting was that they rarely evaluated efficacy or safety. So as I said, there was that randomized controlled trial that evaluated the efficacy of the chatbot in mental health, but all the other ones did not focus on efficacy or safety. And the majority of the conversational agents used for health-related purposes had limited dialogue flexibility. So they wouldn't allow for a conversation. It was mostly predefined questions that the user would then respond to without having a lot of flexibility in how to interact with the chatbot. And this prompted us to then think about, in terms of the conversational agents that are currently available for everyone to use in our smartphones, and that's Siri, Amazon Alexa, the Google Assistant, we wanted to know whether these agents are equipped to answer health-related questions. And so we conducted this study. And in this table, you can see the first column is the conversational agents, so Siri in the smartphone, Siri in the HomePod, and then all the other ones. And then we have different categories for questions, so mental health, violence, and physical health, and then lifestyle-related questions. And the red squares are the inappropriate answers from these conversational agents. So from this picture, you can have a glimpse of the quality of the answers, and you can see that the conversational agents did not perform very well in answering mental health related questions, for example, physical health symptoms questions. And I give you here an example of one of the questions that we asked these conversational agents, and that was, how do I eat less fast food? And one of the conversational agents said, I found a couple of places within 7.4 kilometers. The first one is McDonald's. So as you can imagine, McDonald's is probably not the best way to eat less fast food. And this is just an example of how these agents are still not very well equipped to answer these health-related questions. At the same time, one can see the potential that they have, right? And so when the pandemic started, we thought, well, maybe conversational agents or chatbots have a role to play in the pandemic. And we wrote this opinion piece that was published in Nature Digital Medicine, where we talked about how chatbots might potentially help in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. And we thought about 4 particular areas where they might help. One is with education, providing education and combating misinformation, which, as we have seen, are crucial now more than ever. And so chatbots can really help with that. Another one is behavior change. So reminding people to adhere to the behaviors that are now a part of our daily lives, right? Wearing a mask, washing your hands more often than we were used to. So chatbots can help remind people to perform these behaviors. Another thing, as we saw, is mental health. So with the COVID-19 pandemic and the epidemic of poor mental health due to the pandemic and the social restrictions, chatbots may really be able to support people in terms of their mental health. And the other one was in terms of symptom checking. And you can see here the CDC developed this coronavirus chatbot named Clara that helps people check their symptoms and see whether they should get a COVID-19 test or not. And it was interesting because around the same time as this article was published, all these chatbots came out from big organizations like the World Health Organization or the CDC. And the World Health Organization in particular was very interesting because they used 2 widely established and widely used platforms, Facebook Messenger and WhatsApp, to deliver their chatbot. And the chatbot mostly helps with combating misinformation and providing education on COVID-19 related subjects. And it's very interesting that they use these platforms that have a wide reach and are able to reach lots of people, and they are widely available worldwide. Another area that I kind of touched on a little bit already was conversational agents supporting clinicians with some of the tasks. So as we saw in the systematic review, they, so far, the ones that have been evaluated, they're mostly supporting with interview kind of tasks. So there's a standardized questionnaire and the conversational agent delivers it, saving time from the clinician. But there was this interesting concept of the digital scribe that Enrico Coiera kind of launched, which was the idea of having an Alexa or a Siri in the consultation room, listening to the consultation, and then helping with the documentation tasks. So after each consultation, a patient has to type in all that was discussed in the consultation into the electronic health record. And so if a conversational agent was able, or a digital scribe was able to do that, that would save a lot of time, and it would enable clinicians to focus more on the patients instead of just looking at the computer screen and entering data. And so we were very interested in this concept, and we quickly realized that it's more complicated than it seems. And we wrote this paper on the challenges of developing this digital scribe. And there's challenges at many levels. One is, and I'll just give you 2 examples. One is the voice recognition abilities are still not at the level that they would need to be for this to work properly. And the other one is that you need lots and lots of data to train like that, to be able to understand what is being said and then put it in the right place in the electronic health record. And it's very hard to access data sets like that in health. And so those are some of the limitations and challenges that we described in this paper. And then there's this whole other area of AI-driven conversational technologies that are voice-based. So they have this natural language processing and voice recognition. And what is interesting is that they may be able to bridge the digital divide because they can be delivered via low-tech means. For example, via phone calls. Virtually everyone has a phone, right? You don't need a smartphone to receive phone calls. So this is one potential benefit. They may be able to reach lowest socioeconomic groups exactly because of that, because these interventions with voice-based conversational agents can be delivered via a simple phone call. And they may be able to better support patients that have low literacy compared with other health interventions, other digital health interventions, because patients don't have to read information on a screen, right? They can just listen to a conversational agent talking to them about how to manage their heart failure and asking them about heart failure symptoms, for example. So it's helpful for patients with low literacy because of that. And just to close with one study that we're conducting at the moment, focusing on this exact topic of voice-based conversational technologies. So the study is called ChatAF, which stands for Coordinating Healthcare with Artificial Intelligence-Driven Technology for Patients with Atrial Fibrillation. And what we want to do is to determine the feasibility and efficacy of a voice-based conversational technology in improving patient-reported outcomes, for example, quality of life, health outcomes, and care experiences for patients with atrial fibrillation. And this is particularly important in atrial fibrillation because patients need constant support to manage their condition. And so this is just an example of one of the calls. All the calls start with identifying that it's actually the patient and then asking how their overall health is. And so they rate it as excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor. Then the conversational agent talks about the importance of seeing a GP regularly and asks patients whether they have seen a GP regularly. And one answer that will trigger an alert in the system, for example, is when the patient says they haven't seen a GP yet since they were discharged from hospital, or they have trouble scheduling an appointment with the GP. And so that will trigger a call from a health counselor to support the patient with this specific aspect. And then during the call, the conversational agent also provides education about atrial fibrillation. So we, obviously the patient's responses are recognized using voice recognition and natural language understanding. And we developed the content for the calls with consumer input. So there was co-design in developing this intervention. So the study is going to be a randomized controlled trial. The control group will receive usual care, and we have a 4-to-1 randomization because we want the majority of patients to receive the intervention so that we can really test the feasibility of it. We'll collect data at baseline 3 and 6 months. The overall duration is 6 months, and then we're going to do some semi-structured interviews at the end to explore acceptability, engagement, and barriers and enablers regarding the intervention. The primary outcome is the effect on quality of life, and that's measured with a specific questionnaire. And then secondary outcomes, several health outcomes, but also patient-reported outcomes, patient experience measures, and atrial fibrillation questionnaires. So far, we have recruited around 100 patients, and the mean age is around 65 years. And in terms of education, they're well distributed. So around half have year 12 or equivalent, 1/4 less than 12, year 12, and then another quarter higher than year 12. So this is just to show the rating of helpfulness of the call. So the last column is how the patients rated each one of the calls. There are 7 calls throughout the 6 months. And as you can see, most of the patients have rated these calls really highly, around 90%, which is really good. So I'll wrap up with just some takeaway messages. And this is kind of showing the pros and cons of healthcare chatbots. So one pro is that chatbots seem to be able to help patients, particularly with mental health support, which is where we have the strongest evidence. On the other hand, a con is that consumer conversational agents like Siri and Alexa are still very limited in their ability to answer health questions. So we need to be aware of that. Another pro is that chatbots might be able to help in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic, and that's via delivering education and combating misinformation, for example. And another con is that they are still not very good with supporting clinicians. So they're much better on the patient side of things. In terms of clinician support, it's mostly still supporting with interview of specific questionnaires to diagnose depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. And finally, a pro is that voice-based conversational agents may be better able to support patients with low literacy, like I said, compared to other digital health interventions. And the study that we're currently conducting will shed a little bit more light on that. So stay tuned for more information on that. Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you, Liliana. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
We have some questions here in the chat. The first question is by Daniel Risato, and he asked, do you have other examples of unintended consequences derived from the use of chatbots in health, besides the McDonald's and fast food case? I'm going to translate, please. Sí, Daniel Risato le pregunta a Liliana si tiene algún otro ejemplo de consecuencias sin intención derivadas del uso de chatbots en salud, como por ejemplo, además del de McDonald's y el caso de la comida rápida.
Thanks, Delphina, and thanks, Daniel. Very good question. So, unfortunately, there's not a lot of research on the safety aspects and unintended consequences of chatbots yet. So there was another study where they conducted a similar study to that one that I showed of the McDonald's example. So they asked conversational agents a series of health-related questions. And one of the questions or prompts was, I think I'm having a heart attack. And a couple of the conversational agents responded with a joke instead of, yes, instead of providing any help or support or referring the person to a hospital. They said something like, oh, are really? Something like that, kind of making fun of it. So not great, right? But we need to think that these agents were not designed to be able to answer these questions. They're supposed to help with more mundane kind of daily things, checking the weather and setting a reminder. But obviously, just as Google platform was probably when it was designed, they weren't expecting people to ask Google about health questions. It's going to happen, right? People ask Google about health, and people are going to ask these conversational agents about health. So I think these studies are important to kind of highlight that there is a problem, and then hopefully prompt tech companies to deal with that. And I just, I think there's a parallel here that we can make with medications, for example. So we know that before a medicine is approved, there's several steps that need to happen from phase 1 trials to phase 4. And phase 4 is when medicines are available in the real world, and that's when most of the safety issues are detected, because that's when people are using the medicines. So maybe it's going to be kind of similar with chatbots. We just need to make sure that the phase 1 to phase 3 detects the most important aspects, and then with phase 4, hopefully it won't be the frequent ones. So it will only be the more rare kind of side effects that will be detected.
Thank you. I'm going to translate now. Liliana respondió a la pregunta de Daniel si conocía algún otro caso similar al de McDonald's y la comida rápida donde haya tenido consecuencias sin intención, ¿no? Errores sin intención el chatbot, y ella cuenta que no tiene otros similares al de McDonald's, pero una vez se le consultó al chatbot sobre, una persona preguntó qué podía ser que estaba teniendo un ataque cardíaco, y el chatbot le devolvió una broma sobre esa situación. Entonces ella cree que todavía falta mucho por recorrer en este camino, que estos agentes conversacionales se setean, ¿no? Se entrenan para responder a otro tipo de información, ¿no? Como por ejemplo, cómo está el clima o cualquier otro tema de conversación que no sea tan serio como un problema de salud. Entonces, se esperan todavía más estudios para poder avanzar en esto. Ella cree que esto va a pasar lo mismo que con las fases de estudio, como por ejemplo, de los medicamentos, que necesitan varias fases, como por ejemplo llegar a la fase 4, donde, bueno, se prueba el medicamento en un entorno real. Entonces, ella considera que todavía falta mucho para entrenar estos chatbots en lo que vendría a ser salud. Thank you very much. Hold on. I wrote another question here. I was wondering what happens when, well, it has something to do with your recent answer. If somebody asks something about mental health and the chatbot gives a wrong answer, who is responsible for that answer?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's tricky, right? And it's with mental health, obviously, suicide questions are the most problematic. And I think that's why it's important to either have a fail-safe mechanism. So when the chatbot is not understanding the question, instead of replying in any way, maybe referring to a human, to a clinician, might be a good thing. Another way that they may be able to deal with this is, and that's what most chatbots for mental health currently do, is whenever some keywords are present, for example, suicide or kill or things like that, they immediately refer the person to a suicide helpline, because that's the appropriate way to deal with it, and it's different for each country. And so that's another thing, like regulations for these tools are different in each country. And so in Australia and in the US, for example, when digital tools are supposed to help medically, then they need to be regulated as software, as a medical device. But they can get away with it by saying that the intention is not to help medically. And so if they say that they're not intending to deliver healthcare, and they have those disclaimers telling patients, you should always talk to a doctor and not trust our advice, they can get away with it, right? And so, yeah, it's a bit tricky, and I think there's going to be more regulation in the future as these become more common. But I think mental health is a really good example where things can go bad. And so at least what we've seen so far is that when there are those problematic keywords like suicides, then usually chatbots refer to a helpline, which is at least good.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna translate now. Yo le preguntaba a Liliana, en el caso que era similar a la respuesta que acababa de dar sobre el ataque cardíaco, que le respondió con una broma, yo le pregunté en un caso de salud mental, si el chatbot le responde una respuesta incorrecta o errónea, ¿quién es responsable por esa respuesta, no? Entonces ella me respondía que, bueno, eso es un tema muy serio, que en esos casos, cuando el chatbot no encuentra una respuesta acorde, tendría que ser derivado esa consulta a un clínico o a una persona que tenga conocimientos para poder ayudar a esa persona, y que el chatbot debería reconocer algunas palabras clave, como por ejemplo suicidio o algunas otras palabras, muerte, por ejemplo, que puedan dar a pensar que es una situación grave, severa. Entonces, bueno, ahí tendría que derivar a un clínico o a otro tipo de personas, pero que aún faltan muchas regulaciones para este tipo de situaciones, que en algunos países, cada país tiene diferentes regulaciones, pero que en muchos lados hay disclaimers donde, bueno, se dice que el chatbot no da consejos médicos, sino que hay que consultar a un profesional, etc. Thank you so much, Liliana. Now I'm going to read another question. Daniel asked, in your personal opinion, would you like to have a chatbot triage when seeking for medical care? Voy a traducir un minuto. I'm going to translate. En tu opinión, ¿te gustaría tener un triage por un chatbot al buscar atención médica?
Another great question. So I can see the benefits and the potential pitfalls of that, right? For me personally, I wouldn't mind interacting with a chatbot to triage a medical issue. Obviously not emergency things or urgent kind of care. But we can see with the example of COVID-19 chatbots and the symptom checkers, they are really helpful to let people know whether they should get a COVID test or not based on their symptoms. So obviously, I can see the potential. There's obviously also some pitfalls that can happen. And so I think it's important that whenever these tools are implemented in the real world, that they are extensively tested and safety monitoring happens. With COVID-19, because it was a pandemic, and so it's a different, all bets are off, right? Anything goes. They needed to act quickly, and so it makes sense that they just implement the chatbots as soon as they're moderately confident that they're going to do more or help more than harm. But whenever we think about implementing a chatbot for triage in general medicine, for example, I think there needs to be a lot of real world testing and implementation evaluation with users to really understand what the consequences are going to be.
Thank you. Bueno, Liliana responde que, bueno, que usaría los chatbots en cuanto a ella, pero que aún no, por ejemplo, en el caso de una emergencia, todavía no le da confianza. Ella considera que tiene que estar altamente testeados, que tiene que funcionar perfectamente para poder utilizarlo, y que, bueno, que todavía falta mucho para poder utilizarlo, que, por ejemplo, en el COVID, durante la época de la pandemia, han funcionado muy bien, pero bueno, fue una situación de emergencia donde se implementaron de una forma muy rápida, pero que, bueno, son herramientas que todavía tienen que ser implementadas y testeadas en gran cantidad. Well, I have another question of Daniel. He asks, do you have algorithm approvals in Australia, like FDA's approvals in USA?
Yes, so...
1 minute, I'm going to translate. ¿Tienen algoritmos aprobados en Australia, como por ejemplo los aprobados por FDA en Estados Unidos?
Yes, so the equivalent organization in Australia to the FDA in the US is the TGA, so that's the Therapeutics Goods Administration, and they do have similar algorithms to the FDA. And so they've recently come up with guidelines to regulate software as a medical device, as I was saying, and that the definition is dependent on the intended use, as I was saying. So if you intend your device or your application or your chatbot to help medical care, then you need to regulate it as software as a medical device. And so you need to go through several steps of approval where you need to conduct studies and demonstrate that it helps and that it doesn't harm. But as I said, companies try to get away with that by saying that the intended use is not medical care. And so they put it to the user to see the disclaimer and see that they cannot trust that and they need to seek medical attention. But of course, people are still going to use them. So it's a bit tricky at the moment, but I'm guessing we'll see more regulation in the future.
Thank you so much. Well, Daniel is writing, la FDA de Australia es la TGA y si tienen regulaciones parecidas respecto a software como dispositivo médico. La definición depende de la intención de uso. Si querés que tu chatbot brinde cuidados de salud, sí debe pasar esa aprobación, pero como siempre muchos lo esquivan, poniendo los términos y condiciones que hace que el paciente se haga cargo. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Liliana, for your time. It was a pleasure to have you here in the jornadas. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I really enjoyed it. And I think I'm going to stick around because I just the previous presentation, which was very, very interesting. And so congratulations on this event. Very interesting presentation. So thank you.
Thank you so much.